Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining. Please, may I ask you to write your name and the country, and if possible, please do turn the cameras on so we can see you. We are extremely pleased to have with us today Professor Nicolas and the doctorate candidate Jason from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts of Southern Switzerland, Zug. And we are very, very happy, especially because of the very interesting case study that the two of them put together in a very short time, actually. So really thank you for that. But that's a case study that has really raised the interest of many people. We received questions, but today is an opportunity to make those questions directly to the authors of the video lecture. So Nicolas and Jason, perhaps very briefly, if you can share with us what are the key highlights of this special approach taken by Unia in Switzerland when it comes to the care sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lira, and greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to have a chance to exchange with all of you. I'll be very brief, and then I'll let Jason come in to add a few things. But just to say that what we're looking at here really is a trade union which organizes in a range of sectors, Unia in Switzerland, and which has a number of interesting characteristics. The first one, I think, is Unia is reflecting the Swiss labor market. So the vast majority of its members are migrants, which is something that you see a lot in the way Unia communicates. Everything they do is always done in a series of languages. And it's a union that really tries to start from the needs of workers. And the reason why they decided to focus on the long-term care sector is because, as some people call it, long-term care is the new industrial sector. There used to be in Switzerland factories in every valley and every small town. Now what you have is one or more care homes. And yet the care workers and the people who work in the care homes, not just the medical care workers, are often not organized. So our project really is inserted within an attempt to work with the union to think about how to approach organizing this group of workers, with one particular constraint, which I think is really interesting, which is that many care workers are reluctant to join unions or to mobilize because often they are told, of course, by management, that if you do that, you might harm the residents of the care home or the patients in the hospital, etc., etc. So how to try and overcome this, and this is the context in which our participatory project with Unia was developed. Jason, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Nicolas, and hello, everybody. I mean, just to build off what Nicolas said with Unia's strategy, they really wanted to take a grassroots approach to this problem of this crisis of care, which is affecting Switzerland, much like the rest of the world. And so they formulated this participatory research where we recruited workers, we had group discussions, and the discussions were led and co-developed by frontline care workers. And what we received was a really rich discussion and data collected, while also empowering the workers as they came along and developed the discussions and interview questions. And what we discovered was that when you discovered what the workers they strive for is this control or this input of the organization of their work. So while wages and working conditions, of course, are very important, it appeared the workers wanted to move on beyond the bread and butter issues that unions traditionally collective bargain for. And a lot of this is the allocation of the time, resources, recognition for the work that they do and their expertise, and giving them organizational autonomy. And so what we found possibly ways forward, and what Unia hopes to look towards, is developing these ideas through a Care Manifesto. And so that is actually what we're working on with Unia right now. Again, utilizing this grassroots approach of involving long-term care workers throughout the whole research process and development process to create a Care Manifesto. And while there have been Care Manifestos produced before, our hope based on the project that we're talking about today and this manifesto, is that we'll have a little bit more concrete and actionable items that Unia can then provide to these workers to take to social dialogue, to collective bargaining, and also to society as a whole. And I think that's about it on that end. I'm very excited to have the discussions. I just briefly saw some of the questions that you all left, and yeah, unless Nicolas, you want to add something really quickly.
I'm keen to hear people's comments and questions and start talking.
Yeah.
They've heard the video already.
Yeah, thank you very much. And most people should have watched the video. So we can open now for questions and comments to this case. Some of the people that actually left the comments in diversity platform are sitting here. So it'd be great that we pick up from those, but we can start from Sabasara from India.
Hello. Good evening. I am Sarveswar from India. So just I wanted to know how difficult it is to form union. So in Switzerland, because in India it is very difficult to have unions in any sector, including the health sectors. They usually don't encourage actually. So either you will be fired or simply they will not encourage. So what is the situation in your country? Thank you.
Shall we take one more question or you respond to this? What do you prefer?
As you tell us, and we do what you think is best.
Okay, why don't you just take this question? We take it one by one then.
Well, maybe very briefly, and Jason come in. I would say it's I'm not sure. It's probably not as difficult as in India, but it is difficult to form unions in Switzerland for a couple of reasons. One is that since the 1930s, Switzerland lives in a myth, and the myth is called labor peace, la paix du travail. It was basically the extension of collective agreements that are very, very, very widespread in Switzerland, usually not very protective of workers, but that entail preventing striking, for example. And so you have a lot of collective agreements, but when you start creating a union that is a worker-driven union, often you meet with a lot of hostility from established unions and from employers. So it's difficult. And the other reason, which has actually led Switzerland to be finger-pointed by the ILO alongside Belarus, is that Switzerland doesn't have any protection in its labor law for activists, for union organizers. So it's very common that people will start creating a union branch and then will be very soon dismissed very early on. And there's very little that you can do legally to protect against this. So it's a weak union movement, except in a few sectors. And it's very difficult to penetrate new sectors, such as care. To which I would add the thing I said at the end of what I said, which is there's very widespread fear that many care workers have. Would this harm the residents? And I think what we try to show in our research with Unia is actually if the workers don't actually mobilize, that's when the residents and the patients will be in trouble. I hope I answered your question, comrade.
And maybe
Thank you.
Yes, Jason.
I could just add quickly too. I mean, based on what Nicolas was saying, it's also created kind of a culture of it's not as ingrained trade union activism. So I know when I teach at the University of Zurich, I mean, I do classes in labor geography, and a lot of my students, I'll be honest, a lot of them don't even know what a trade union is. So you can kind of see that it's still, yeah, it's not in the culture either, based on these reasons that Nicolas has outlined, which makes it difficult, obviously.
Thank you. Even from Ghana, Comrade, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you hear me.
The audio is a bit difficult, but let's try.
Okay, so I'll try. So I just want to find out, thank you for the presentation on the Unia issue in Switzerland. I just want to find out, do you have issues of members in Switzerland also complaining about they having access to provision of loans, welfare packages? I mean, welfare, like loans, high purchase, unlike the traditional services which the union provides to them, that's doing collective bargaining agreements for them. Do the members also for welfare packages, unlike here in Ghana. I don't know if you understand, Elira.
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit. It's really very difficult, the audio. Why don't you type it in the chat, please? Really sorry for that, but it's quite difficult to understand, unless you understood Jason and Nicolas. No, yeah, please do.
I heard some words, and then the others were
Yeah.
lower, so it was difficult to. I'm really sorry, Ebenezer.
Yeah,
Do you mind typing the question?
yeah, thanks a lot, Eben. Somebody else would like to put a question or a comment to our speakers for today? If not, I can perhaps, I mean, Brian, you did have a question to both speakers today. Would you want to say that, or you want me to read it? And Jordan, you too. So just let me know what you prefer.
Good morning, Elira. You could read my question, that's fine.
All right. So let me check what's I think your question, Jordan, was what advice do you give to union researchers who haven't done it yet? An action research project involving the union members. And Jordan left also an extensive comment under your video lecture, which is very impressive, really, for many people. So who would like to respond to that?
Can you just repeat? At the same time, I've finally found the questions underneath the video, so I was looking.
Okay. Yeah,
So what is the question exactly?
It's like, what advice do you give to union researchers who haven't done an action research project involving the union members yet?
Well, I can have a go, and Jason, I'm sure will complete. You know, we made the road as we walked it, to be honest. You know, we and this is we were interested in doing a participatory research for several reasons. One is that we are close to the north of Italy, which, as some of you may know, is the home of something called Conricerca, which was an approach to research developed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in factories in northern Italy by the so-called operaista Italian left. And the idea was to do research with workers. So it was not about workers, but with workers. And we realized that a lot of the literature on Conricerca, sorry for the Italians, but was theories about what was good or bad or who originated it, more than a practical guide on how to do it. So we really had to, in many ways, we had to do it along the way. And what we did is that we try to think about how to meaningfully involve workers at as many steps of the way as possible, in the conceptualization, in the collection of data, in the analysis of data, etc. And it was extremely fruitful. But it was also challenging. And I would say that the challenging element was that at some point we had to accept that, at least as things are now, it's possible to involve workers and unionists, but you do need to have a lead in the way in which you conduct a project. You do need to have a lead simply because we are used perhaps as researchers to doing research projects. Workers are not used to that. So it's about sort of But I'm happy to share in more detail somewhere else our experience and what we've learned from it. We're even hoping to write a bit about this and present it at the GLUE conference with Jason, because I think there's a renewal of interest in worker-driven research. I think a lot of the textbook of how to do it has to be written, and of course depends on the degree of interest by workers to participate. What we had, where we were very lucky, is that we realized that the workers in long-term care are incredibly passionate around the question of how to improve the provision of long-term care. And for us, this ended up becoming our central point, which is that, which I think Jason finished with, it's not just about empowering workers to have a union to demand better wages that is at stake here. It's that the long-term care, or many other parts of our economies and societies, as I'm sure you're seeing in this course, the system is broken. And it's broken because it's driven by market principles. It's all about making profits, and that's primarily destroying the way in which care is provided. the only way we can reinvent this is by building on what the con ricerca people call l'intelligenza operaia, worker intelligence, no? The intelligence of the labor process, of the work they're doing of workers. But of course, the challenge is that it's been 20, 30, 40, 50, some maybe more years that workers have been told that they shouldn't apply their worker intelligence to organizing the labor process, that they should just follow orders or chase indicators. And so we found like a really, you know, in our case, a really rich thing to work with, but clearly it was more work than if we had done a more classical research project. Our hope is that it's also the basis for a certain mobilization, and I'll stop talking, but what we found very hopeful was that the union, so we also involved a number of union officers in our research, and they were really fascinated with this because they learned a lot about the conditions of work in long-term care, even though that's their sector, from it. And they said that they would reuse it, you know, for example, the method of group discussions, which is very rich to allow ideas to emerge, that they would reuse it to try and strengthen their groups and their work. So we're hoping that it's really a beginning. I'm not sure. Jason, please come in. I'm sure you can.
No, I mean, that summed it up pretty good. I would say just on a practical note, which I'm sure you would be aware of, is that to recognize also the workers and what it entails for them to participate. And I think we were aware of that, but maybe not as much as we should have been when we were doing the project. So for us, for example, we're dealing with a workforce that, as we found out and had assumed, is very time constrained, with schedules varying all over the place, mentally drained, burnt out a lot of times. And to us as researchers and maybe union officials, a 90-minute interview to us is, oh, okay, that's not bad. I mean, it's easy to do, or to fill out these surveys. I mean, what is that? But for the workers, that does involve actually a lot of capacity sometimes to do based on their schedule. So I think when you're designing a project like this, very much take into account these other factors that pertain to the workers you want to involve. Because I think it's important for the project to succeed, to recognize that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, we've had a number of discussions in the workshops that have been done last week and this week, and really this question of alienation of workers from the provision of services, which that sort of alienation, we usually discuss it in the context of production, industrial production. But we've seen how these new public management methods have led to the same sort of alienation of public sector workers, and how that has damaged also the public ethos of the sector. But it is there that I think your research is so interesting, because if I remember correctly, one of the sources of frustration of workers were the fact that they knew they were not providing the service that the people deserved. So that was in itself a burden, and it's kind of a resistance to that sort of alienation that the system tries to impose on them in terms of fragmenting everything and saying this number of minutes you are here and this number of minutes are there. So did you find out that one to be, was that something that was a knowledge that was always there, or is it something that came out as workers kind of reflected collectively on the struggles? Because I think in our work too, that's the one kind of thing we notice, that there are a few things that we recognize at individual level, but when people come collectively and start discussing, that's when they actually start articulating those in much clearer terms. So what's your sense of that from this process of engagement?
I would say what you said now is perfectly captures it. Don't know if you agree, Jason, but there's clearly, shared feelings, because, a standardized labor process means that people have ultimately a bit of a standardized or common experience of it. But what was fascinating across the 5 different discussion groups was really, the emergence of very converging across the groups, even though they were in different contexts, of an analysis that converged around the same issues. It made for us writing the analysis part of the report very easy, because clearly what emerged was a bit what you said, which is the conditions prevent the possibility of providing good care. Because the targets, that are set in a way that are not compatible with that good care. It doesn't mean that, however, being aware of that is equal to being ready to make the leap to say, let us now fight to be the ones determining how good care is set. There is still resistance to that. There is still, people are, workers are still used to being told what to do. So it's a process, but it's a very, I believe, a very exciting and promising process.
Thank you. Ian, and please introduce yourself too.
Good morning. My name is Ian Hostred from a small island state, Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean. For my background, I tend to work a lot with informal workers. Did you discover could you elaborate on any additional difficulties you face dealing with informal care workers with respect to your research?
So our research we didn't look, we focused for various reasons that I'm happy to discuss. We focused on care homes, so institutional care, and I think informal care workers, actually, there are some in Switzerland, but they will exist in home care. So people who are basically home carers. Actually, Jason's a colleague of ours, Karen Schütter from Zurich, has worked on the terrible situation of home-based carers in Switzerland during the COVID pandemic, who basically found themselves imprisoned in the homes of the people they were looking after without really being able to leave at all. But we didn't focus on them, because we didn't have enough time and resources to do a research that included them. And in fact, I'll send a question back to you, because our colleague Karen, who works on this topic, has developed a belief, which I would love to hear people's thoughts on, and yours in particular, Ian. She told us she thinks that it's almost impossible to guarantee decent working conditions when you're dealing with a carer who works at home, who's supposed to be available 24/7. So whatever way you look at it, the degree of inequality and the degree of responsibility, literally you could be held accountable for somebody falling while you're asleep, is literally what we're talking about. And so we hope our work will lead into alliances with the question of care more broadly, including home care, but this wasn't our focus. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you basically highlight some of the challenges that we face, because from a standpoint of power, you're basically held at ransom to your employer. And as in all cases, individuals are actually desperate for work. So things that a unionized, organized union would actually, individuals that are actually members of a union would actually have some form of recourse. In the context of the informal sector, that's not there. So it's difficult to set these kind of standards within the framework of the informal sector. From my standpoint, there has to be some mechanism where you can formalize workers, and it's something that I've been pushing for unions to get more involved in the informal sector across the board, not just in healthcare, because these things tend to trickle over into the more formal sector.
I've got a suggestion on this, because one, I don't know if it's a reason for a reluctance to unionize, but one very strong element that we realized, especially strong with the nursing profession, is, how to summarize it, the fact that you have a very qualified group, so nurses, that because of gender prejudice and in a range of historical factors tends to be underpaid, looked down upon, not respected. And there's a very strong, and it's one of the key things, a strong thirst for recognition of just how complex, skilled, demanding the work of care is, you know. And it's demanding, of course, if you're a specialized nurse. It's also demanding if you're a nursing assistant. To be honest, it's incredibly demanding if you're a cook. Think about it. No, you have to cook meals in a care home with 80 people. You have 80 different kinds of ailments with very specific intolerances. And you have to cook for people for whom the 3 meals they have a day are effectively, often, sorry to say, the only moments of joy in the entire day. So it's an incredibly important job. And so, you know, one of the key things that will come out, hopefully, of the manifesto we are writing for good care and of the movement that hopefully will grow in Switzerland of long-term care workers is demanding greater recognition, not just financial, but also societal, of the role they are playing and the fact that it takes a lot of effort and skills to be able to provide good care to somebody who's 90 and has, you know, advanced dementia and yet still provide good care. And it's obvious to me that it's the same demand for recognition could apply to all the home carers, informal or formal, right? That work is just incredibly difficult work. The idea, and of course you put your finger on it, Ian, is can we build alliances across different groups of workers as opposed to having divisions? That's what I hope we can see. Ebenezer has pasted a question to me. So can I just read it?
Yes, please do. I was about to do that, but go ahead.
Oh, you have it too. Okay.
Go ahead.
Do unions in Switzerland also encounter issues of welfare packages for them to do for their members? In Ghana, union members, aside the traditional collective bargaining agreement, which the union does for them, also require welfare benefits like soft loan to assist members. Is it the same in Switzerland? So do the unions in Switzerland provide a series of direct services to their members, right? Am I getting this right? Yeah. I think there is some element of that, but probably less than what you're describing. I was aware of this, for example, in many former communist countries. What I've seen in Ukraine, for example, or in Moldova, was that element is very strong. I think it's less strong in Switzerland. The service union element. What is, however, the case is that the Swiss trade unions are involved in the administration of the unemployment payments. But I mean, it's not something, you know, it's a part of what they do. So they have a lot of institutional insertion, but not necessarily, unless I'm missing something, Jason, I don't think there is that sort of direct services that's required of unions. In fact, as Jason was saying, many people don't want anything to do with unions in Switzerland in the first place.
Do you want to add something, Jason, or?
No, I think that's basically it. I mean, they offer some legal services when you have, of course, employment disputes, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. The other question is from Kevin from Mauritius. Would you like to make the question directly?
Yeah, if possible. Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Nicolas and Jason. So my question would be that you talk about the care workers. They were reluctant in the beginning to join the union because of certain kind of fear or something like that. Here in Mauritius also, we have this problem. That is, we are not canvassing people to join unions, but we want them to join unions in order for them to know their rights. And we, as trade unionists, be able to fight for them. But there is still that fear. So I want to know, how did you, in a certain sense, I want to put it in between inverted commas to say that you convinced them to join the unions and try to make them see the reasons that whatever we are fighting, there's a positive cause for that. Thank you.
I think that's an amazing question, Kevin. So let me be clear. Jason and I haven't single-handedly demultiplied the union membership among care workers in Switzerland. What my answer will be a bit more that the project that we've developed with Unia is very much trying to do just that, to overcome these internal obstacles. And how so? Let me try and just phrase it this way. If workers agree and see that their collective mobilization is the key to improving long-term care, So not just improving their individual situation, but improving their ability to provide good care. And if they see that society sees that and sees that their struggle isn't perceived to be a categorical struggle around one particular issue that only concerns them, but sees that their struggle is articulated with a broader transformation of the care system, our hope is that we'll be able to make that shift from being reluctant because of capitalist propaganda, if I can call a cat, no? From being reluctant to actually seeing, which is what we're arguing, that it's the other way around. Without mobilization, there will be no return from marketization. Without mobilization, there will be no good care or no good education or no good, you can fill the public service that you've just, or transport for that matter. And I think that's something that's really interesting, in a context where we think a lot about the union movement as being on the back foot. There is increasingly this realization that unions are often there to defend much more than just their members. They're there to defend broader societal interests. And our impression with care workers is that's an essential selling point or element to put forward. We're not just saying you should demand higher wages, because then people say, oh, well, how can we afford it? We're saying you need higher wages because of this, because we need to improve quality care, or to borrow, excuse me, an expression, we need to care for those who care. It doesn't take much thinking to realize that if somebody is exhausted and stressed and overworked, they cannot provide decent care to a vulnerable person, right? You don't want the person who's looking after your mother or your grandmother or your child, for that matter, to be in that situation. So I think this articulation is crucial. And what I think, and I'd love to hear you and others on this, it's also a bit new for trade unions. Not new in the sense of unions are used to saying we're fighting for something bigger, but here it's about, and this is where we're at in our thinking. We haven't got a solution. If we're not just fighting for better working conditions, but we're fighting for a transformation of the way in which work is organized, we want to sit at the table with effectively a bunch of doctors and economists and private sector people who decide on the criteria for measuring quality of care and who decide on everything. There's no workers involved there. We want to sit at this table. We want to participate at the level of the care homes. We want to be involved in those discussions. Unions are not necessarily equipped to do that. So how do we equip ourselves, and support members to do that? And I think that's exciting, but that's also a tall order. It's not going to be easy. And we're thinking about it. We certainly don't have a solution.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, just finalizing that point from Nicolas, and maybe I can post it in the chat. There is an example we kind of look at in the state of Minnesota in the United States that recently created this kind of tripartite Nicolas was saying about going beyond just the wages of the long-term care sector in Minnesota, but actually having the workers' voice on how the work is organized, what the working conditions will look like. So it served. There are some forms of inspiration, but it's a tall order, because I mean, maybe it sounds a bit pessimistic, but one big obstacle is it's not only that the employers in long-term care can utilize budgetary constraints, but they're also able to exploit workers' vocation, basically. So, using rhetoric that's, implying that if you join a union, if you do worker action, who are you going to affect? You're going to affect your 80-year-old resident that needs you each day. I mean, I say that it can be an exploitive measure, but it can be effective. So it's another challenge specific to this sector that also makes organizing difficult.
Yeah, and one of the discussions we have had during these weeks has been also like, how do unions in the public sector engage in industrial action? Because it's not the same thing as stopping production, that it's the communities that are going to feel the burden of that. And there have been many innovative examples of how the unions have done that. Like, for instance, refusing, instead of going on strike in the transport sector, refusing to collect the fares. Or instead of going in strike in the hospital sector, bringing in retired nurses and doctors to say, this is how a public service fully staffed, properly staffed would look like. And this is the kind of care that we want to provide. So it brings in also a kind of a transformation into the union thinking. But perhaps we can park that for the moment, because I think there are a couple of very interesting questions from Erica. Erica, do you want to read those? Erica, I'm not sure. Do you want to read those yourself?
No, you can go for it.
But it'd be better that you read it. Please do. All right.
Okay, sounds good. I can do
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
I was just trying to open the chat box again. So the question is, I think you guys have mentioned that you were working with a very time-constrained workforce. So how did you work around that in terms of, or how would you suggest working around that to be able to build worker intelligence? And also, after building worker intelligence, what are some of the pathways towards transforming the healthcare system? Or the care system in general, not the healthcare system. I'm thinking about this in the context of transforming the healthcare system, them knowing that that it's being in a union or unionizing is not just about demanding fair wages. It's also about transforming the healthcare, the care system, so that they're able to offer quality services. And what are some of the pathways that maybe you've seen pursue in Switzerland?
Jason, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I guess getting over the difficulties of recruiting the people and getting them to participate in the research. I mean, it was difficult. As I mentioned earlier, I think a big part is when you start, you really need to recognize what you're dealing with, and who the workforce is, and the special elements, I guess, unique elements with that workforce. I mean, to be honest, it's not ideal, but I mean, Zoom online meetings can help, because it's a little bit easier, right? In person is obviously better a lot of times, but it's better than nothing. And I mean, of course, we had fruitful results from our Zoom meetings. Yeah, I think it's just, with this go in a sector like that, I think it's really utilizing the communication tools, digitalization, one could say. Yeah, I don't know, Nicolas, any points on that to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a spot on question, Eric, because the reality is these workers are so under stress, and it's not just a question of a lot of work. It's just it's incredibly demanding work. So the way in which the management literature or the management people look at the problem is because they can't understand why there's so much turnover, right? And the turnover, of course, and the absenteeism reflects the difficult conditions. So you can imagine that getting people to either participate in group discussions or come to union meetings is very difficult. Add to this another element, of course, which that I made a comparison with factories, but it's not entirely correct because care homes tend to be a bit smaller, certainly in Switzerland, And in fact, it's well accepted that it's better for everyone to have a care home that's not a huge care home with thousands of residents. So in terms of, and of course, people don't have the same time because, some people need to be there during the night, some people during the morning, some people during the afternoon. You need 24/7 care for the residents. So there's a number of obstacles. We tried our best to overcome them, as Jason said, by being flexible. But really, we were able to do it through, so for recruiting for our project, we reached out through the internet, and there's a lot of conscience at the moment of the problems of the sector. So we got people to get back to us. Very few people actually agreed to come to the actual group discussions from this initial group of several hundred people. And that reflects the difficulties the union is having in reaching the workers. So I think, using digital technology is one, but there's definitely a need to try and up the game. Our bet is that we have enough understanding to think about making concrete proposals, both for transforming care, this is what the manifesto will do, but also for empowering workers to be much more involved in the management and the planning of care. And of course, at the heart of this, what does the worker intelligence tell us? Something very obvious, very simple. We need time. We need time to provide care. We need time to talk to our colleagues about how best to provide care for Mr. Nicolas, who is old and sometimes difficult because he keeps talking all the time. How do we deal with that particular character? No? And if, and it's this request for time that I think is really center. And of course, part of this time has to be also time for reflecting. I'm not sure I've done justice to your very deep question, Eric, but happy to hear more from you also.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. There is another question from Sarvasara, which is more about the organizational structure of the system, and more like whether it's public or private, and perhaps that's may play a role, because yesterday we had a workshop with somebody from the KPTU in South Korea, where the fight is really about bringing private care homes into public hands and in public management. So what's the situation like in Switzerland? I think that's the question of Sarvasara.
Good question. It's a mix, huh? I mean, broadly speaking, you've got three types of care homes. The public care homes that are owned directly by the canton. Canton would be like a state in the United States, or a Land in Germany, or a province in South Africa. As the entity, the local entity. You have the private ones, which are the ones that are the fastest growing ones, linked to a few multinationals, Orpea, for example. And then you've got a growing category, which people forget to think is problematic, but which we think is problematic. It's the foundations. Now, what are these foundations? They are created by, let's say, a canton or a municipality. But and then they are not for profit, but the raison d'être, the reason why these foundations exist, is in order to avoid that the workers have civil servant status. So you can have contracted workers with more precarious work, which would be impossible if they were employed through a directly publicly controlled entity. And this is why I think in the video we mentioned this thing of the struggle for public services is about much more than just questions of ownership. I think many of you must have seen in this course or in your experiences that you can have public ownership that is managed just as in a market-oriented way as a private company, and perhaps even worse in some cases. So it's really about, and I think that care really puts this question at the center. Is it possible to have private ownership, which by definition or market orientation is about profits and efficiency, when what you're providing is care for vulnerable people? It's something that, I don't know, Jason, what you think. It seems to me, even unprompted, all the groups we had, this question came up, and the answer was a very emphatic no. It's impossible. What we do professionally, what we understand we have to do, is not compatible with having a profit motive. The problem is the profit motive is obvious in the case of a private care home. It's there, but it's hidden under, for example, indicators and targets and so-called new public management in many other cases. Jason, on this, do you want to?
No, I mean, I think that sums it up quite well. That as you finished with the private, I mean, it is growing though, slowly, not like in other countries, but I think it's at 47% right now in Switzerland. But as Nicolas said, I mean, it becomes an impossible task, because what the private sector homes are looking for, and this goes to this debate of alienation of work, is that they're focused on the valorization. So how can they squeeze as much labor as they can for the cheapest way possible and the most efficient way? But what the workers want to see is the user value, right? They want to see the value of the patient enjoying their care. And this is a conflict, a clash. And that's all that will happen with the private sector. It's inevitable. I mean, the private sector is there to make profit. And so they cannot go to this user value system. It's just an antithesis to them.
Yeah, and it's exactly in that contradiction and tension that actually the sparks for organizing could be found among workers. But we have a question from Jordan, and then I take Kevin also to wrap it up perhaps. Jordan, why don't you make the question, please?
Yeah, I'd like to. Thank you, Lyra. Hi, Jason. Hi, Nicola. Another question for you, and I'm not sure if you've already spoken to it today and I missed it, but I'm curious to know if part of the barrier to people participating had to do with racialization or their status as migrant workers. Were many of the participants adequately representing people from visible minorities? I don't know if in Switzerland it's the case, but in Canada, this country quite explicitly imports people from certain skill and occupation groups. And so, for example, if you're a nurse from Philippines or from India, Canada welcomes you with wide open arms to come and work in our long-term care homes. It's very exploitative. It drains the global south of their own resources. And so I'm curious if maybe a similar problem is happening in Switzerland, and if those workers were reluctant to participate in the research compared to other workers who are not from visible minority groups.
So on the composition of the long-term care workforce, it's similar and different in Switzerland in the sense that Switzerland is you have to think of Europe as a fortress, and within that fortress there is a small fortress inside the fortress, which is Switzerland. So they're reliant on migrant labor for long-term care, and increasingly so. But they choose as much as possible migrant labor from countries where people are not racialized or are white, basically. So it's the neighboring countries, France, which of course can bring in racialized people, Germany, Austria, and Italy especially. And then it's a lot of Eastern Europeans that work in the long-term care sector. I started off today by saying that what I think makes Unia interesting is that this is not specific to long-term care, by the way. The Swiss labor market is largely made up of foreigners. That's why Switzerland has such a low unemployment rate, because it's a very old country, with an economy that's bloated. So it's unique almost in the world. It structurally is not populous enough to meet its labor market needs. And of course, that's the case also in long-term care. So I think there was no particular issue with people participating in our research because they were foreigners, but there's no doubt that the hostility to unions that is very strong in Switzerland creates an added layer of threat for people who have a migrant background or migrant racialized background, because they're particularly vulnerable. What you do find, though, is that, especially I think with the French, who work mostly in the west of Switzerland, and to a lesser extent with the Italians, is that they have a much stronger trade union culture than the Swiss. And so sometimes that can mitigate it. I think it's one of the many challenges. And I would agree with you, by the way, on the fact that it's very clearly what's happening now in long-term care. The conditions are impossible. People go in, they get consumed and thrown out, and they burn out or leave the sector. And so the response to that is to lower the bar and attract more migrants, people on lower pay with more casual contracts. And I think it's definitely what the private companies that are entering the sector, that's definitely what they're doing. And just to add to, apart from being horrible from a point of view of exploitation, imagine the difficulty for an elderly person to be living in a care home where the people around them keep changing all the time because of the turnover. It's torture for somebody who is old to actually have to form new relationships on a weekly or monthly basis. So there's a range of things I think that are converging nicely around saying it's time to stop clapping, as even the OECD said, and move forward with something a bit more concrete for the sector.
Jason, do you want to add anything, or?
No, I think Nicola covered it all. we had a lot of responses from migrant workers, and I mean, they represent about 38% of the long-term care. I think where where it could be more interesting, and where your question, Jordan, is maybe more applicable, or could have more, I guess, debate, is the informal or the home care workers. There is where you might find there's a lot more exploitation of this kind of migrant status, particularly in the French part. They're called without papers, sans papier, and to try to recruit them would be difficult because, again, our colleague that researches this mentioned that these home care workers, I mean, they're afraid to even cross the street. You know, in the sense when the light is red, all the Swiss people are crossing. There's no cars. They will not cross because, of course, they're afraid that they could be stopped, and they don't take empty trains a lot of times because then they might be picked out by the authorities. So I think that population would be very difficult to engage in any kind of research on union activities, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. We are about to wrap up. So we have the question from Kevin, whether you faced any unions opposing your approach. And perhaps also as a wrapping up question, while unions are embarking in this kind of initiatives, one would expect that that has an impact also on the union in terms of how it transformed the union internally, whether in terms of structures, but also thinking and strategies and perhaps even articulation of their own visions. What would you say is happening with Unia in as far as this initiative is concerned? And of course, the question of Kevin in the chat box. And both of you can have a couple of minutes to do it, 3 to 4 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Unia, yeah, so it's a very good question, Elira, and very good question, Kevin. Yes, there is, and I think, you know, Switzerland here is, and I'm afraid many of you will say you have the same in your country. As you know, it's the same at international level. There seems to be a tension that pits public sector unions that organize people in the care sector against private sector unions that try to organize people in the privatized hospitals, care homes, or other things. And there's a lot of tension, certainly in Switzerland, between those two unions. So we have tried our best to bring in, it's called VPOD, the public sector union, but they wouldn't engage with this project, which is a shame. And I think it's, you know, it goes into, and I'll answer as a response to my own question what you said, Elira. I think in Unia there is interest and political support for organizing long-term care, but there's also a position of saying, well, let's see if you manage to get the members that make you a significant part of the union, because, you know, there's other sectors, construction, retail, where the union has large numbers, strong, established, has resources. It's pouring these resources into trying to organize these very atomized care homes. And I can sense they won't say it, but a lot of people in the union look at us and say, okay, let's see. Let's see when you're actually going to deliver the goods, which is the members, the actual changes. And, you know, if at some point you can't deliver it, then, you know, it will be difficult to sustain that support. At least that's my perspective. And what is the way forward? You know, some people think in Switzerland, I think they may have a point, is in order to overcome those tensions is to say, let's have a union for care that takes the elements of Unia and the other union, SSP, VPOD it's called, and brings them together and says anyone who works in care should refer to that union, as opposed to having unions that are basically a little bit sort of like, you know, fighting each other.
Yeah, well said, Nicolas. I don't think I can add much on the latter point, but maybe I wouldn't say it was opposition from unions, from this union, but maybe a little bit more critique of I guess you could call it the Nurses Association. That they just, you know, they saw that the organizing that Unia was doing, and, you know, kind of wondered how much does this, you know, how much are nurses part of this whole long-term care picture and campaign that Unia is doing. And I think that goes on what Nicolas was saying earlier about how the nurses, because of this certain skill set, education level, and what the positions they hold, they're kind of in this flux, right? And and to be honest, they've worked hard to get that recognition that we said a lot of times they lack. And so we kind of got a little bit of, critiques of putting them in there and maybe not having a nurse as part of the research team. But yeah, that's it. Nothing major, but that was something that we ran into. That was good for us to reflect on.
Perhaps that makes me want to add one more point, which we haven't mentioned, but which I think is important in trying to build a union in care. One of the obstacles is that one group of workers in care, the nurses, the professional nurses, in many contexts has already organized. And as I said, organized around the idea of respect our skills, which is very good. But the problem is that they tend to very much dominate the agenda. And very often, I hope this will not offend anyone, but my impression is very often when you speak to nurses, their perspective is everything will work better if we have more qualified nurses. The problem is we just get too many of these nursing assistants and people without the proper skills. And to a certain extent, I think this is nonsense. You cannot run a care home having only professional nurses. You need a range of professions. And I think the challenge for unions is to say, can we organize all of these professions and create a kind of common interest? Or do people actually see themselves in opposition, which of course plays right into the hand of management?
Yeah, and I think perhaps we can also wrap up on that note. I know that there are more questions to discuss. There are always more questions, but that really bringing that solidarity within the different groups of workers, and perhaps even challenging this skilled and unskilled workers that capital wants often to use and has imposed on the workers to kind of devalue the working of certain groups of workers. And as you mentioned, Nicolas, even the work of the cook is so important there and so particular, which would be taken like, oh, anybody can cook for 80 people. So it's just really, really interesting. There are a few questions about the gender dimension, but I suppose, I don't know whether you want to have a minute to say something on that, on how did that play into this whole research, and then we conclude with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that the reason why there is an insufficient recognition of how difficult and skilled it is to care boils down to gender discrimination, boils down to gendered roles and the way in which societies have often not recognized how complex it is to be a woman and what it means to provide care. And the naturalization, of course, of care, as if providing care was a natural extension of being a woman, and it makes it I think it's the heart of the struggle of many nurses, that I was referring to, was to say what we are doing is complex from a variety of points of view and requires respect. And I think the question is, can we expand this to all forms of care? And it doesn't mean to say that, care, the tension for me is, sorry, maybe I'm taking it in a slightly different direction, is you want recognition, you want professionalization, but you don't want commodification, right? And I think that's why, from these kinds of research and movements, we also need to think, what kind of society do we want and where do we place the role of care in these societies? And perhaps part of the answer is that if we have the voices of care workers, many of whom are women, much more strongly at the fore, maybe finally we're going to start seeing societies that move in a different direction. But these voices need to express themselves and be heard.
Well, thank you very much. I want to join also what everybody in the chat is putting in, thanking you for a very, very interesting discussion. And thank you for preparing this excellent video lecture, which is really valuable contribution to our course. So Thanks also to everyone for the questions and comments that you made in the course platform, and see you next week. We're going to discuss the transport chapter. Please do watch the video lectures before the workshop so we can have a more insightful discussion. Thank you very much, really.